have with us Professor Yan Xuetong, Dean of the Institute of International Relations here at Tsinghua University. He's one of the most cited political scientists here in China. In 2008, he's named by Foreign Policy magazine as the top 100 public intellectuals. Professor Yan Xuetong, good to finally see you.
It's my pleasure.
You formulated the theory of moral realism.
Yes.
First of all, what exactly is it, and why do you think that is a more useful theory in predicting interstate relations?
Okay. Actually, my theory attribute political leadership as the independent variable for the change of the country, or the growth or decline of a country, and also it attributes the international leadership as an independent variable for the stability or chaotic of the international order. So this theory concerns the type of leadership is very important, and we have no matter national leaders or the international leaderships, there are different types, and different types of international leaderships, and will bring about different political order, and the same different national leadership, and will bring different result for a country's growth or decline.
And then how different is it? I mean, when you compare it against traditional realist theories, I mean, especially in predicting the future of geopolitics globally.
For Marxism and liberalism, they regarded the political system as an independent variable and it determines the social change. So my theory is different from them. I attribute the fundamental factor as the political leadership instead of a political system. And in regarding the IR theories and liberalism and realism and constructivism, they emphasize the factors at the structure level, like the power structure, international norm or culture, or the institutions. And actually my theory regards the leadership or political leadership is more important than that three things.
So how much did you draw from traditional Chinese wisdom, its history, its philosophy, in formulating your moral realist theory?
In the ancient Chinese philosophy, they strongly emphasize the role of the political leadership. So in the Shangshu, the oldest Chinese book, and which said that, and even the chaos in the other area is my fault, and the fault of the son of the heaven. So regarded, in Chinese traditional political thinking, they concern the leadership should undertake the full responsibility for all, both good things and bad things.
And then how useful do you think this moral realist theory in predicting the current U.S.-China competition/confrontation?
Well, first, I think this theory effectively explained and why and Trump's type of leadership and make Americans' soft power decline. And also certainly the theory predicted that, and if they can have a new type of leadership, like today's Joe Biden, so the new type of leadership will resume Americans' soft power in the world. So it's happened.
Okay, last time you talked to CGTN, my colleague, you predicted that the world order will become increasingly bipolar.
Yes.
With the U.S. and China emerging as two great superpowers.
Yeah.
And now after COVID, I mean, as countries are emerging from COVID, do you think the current trends affirmed your prediction back then?
I did the prediction in 2013. I made an argument at that time, and the world will become of a bipolar configuration. And actually, the year before, that means in 2019, the UN Secretary General and Guterres already said the world is possibly to be divided into two. And last year, he said that the world is on the way to be splitted by two economic
By that you mean
superpowers.
China and the U.S. or China and the
U.S.
rest? Okay.
He means the two largest economy. So it means from my understanding, my prediction, and I made the prediction, the world will becomes faced with a bipolarity in 2003. Seems to me, and I'm a little bit conservative, and it's already become a bipolar world today.
And then really the question that is on the mind of many is, where is U.S.-China confrontation headed? Is it going to be a vicious competition, the race to the bottom, or more of a healthy competition as Beijing hopes, like an Olympic Games?
I think in short term, I mean within next 2 years, and the China-U.S. relationship will getting worse and worse. The deterioration and cannot be prevented because China and the U.S. cannot reach an agreement on the nature of their bilateral relations. And the U.S. defined China-U.S. relationship as a competition, and China rejected this definition. So before these two sides have a common understanding or common definition for their bilateral relationship, they can hardly cooperate with each other.
Why do you think the Biden administration insists that China is a threat, both existential and in terms of values? I mean, they talk a lot about values, human rights concerns in Xinjiang, in Hong Kong. Do you think that is why the two sides are clashing, at least from the Washington's perspective? Or do you think America is more afraid of China's national power and China's rise?
Well, I think actually the fundamental factor is that China's rise, reducing the power gap between China and the U.S. That means China is growing stronger and stronger, and in visible future, and to be as strong as the United States. So that makes America lose its dominating position in the world. And the second factor, and like what you said, is they also Biden administration worry about Americans' value will no longer become the dominating value in the world. And he worry about China's value will become a global value.
But do you think they get the Chinese value right? I mean, of course, there has been this hype about China being a threat, violating international norms, not protecting its citizens, not respecting its citizens' human rights, portraying this image of China being a threat. Did America get China right?
Well, my understanding, the competition between China and the U.S., and if we focus on the ideological competition, their competition is not for any individual, but they compete for who has a stronger ideological influence on the world. And at this moment, we see that the liberalism is declining from the Trump administration. And it seems to me, Biden knows that it's impossible for him to resume liberalist domination in the world within his first term. And so he wants to save the liberalism, but even Trump himself do not use the term liberalism. He knows the liberalism is no longer that popular in the United States. He have to use some new word to describe America's value, and so currently he uses democracy instead of liberalism. And so from my understanding, this, that's what Trump concern. From a Chinese perspective, the concern about the ideological confrontation is different. And China worry about this competition may undermine the Chinese domestic political value at home, not internationally. So China try to defend, the Chinese government try to defend its own political value at home, rather than to compete with the U.S. and on the ideological expansion or influence over the world.
You said you worry about Biden's success in rebooting the Democratic alliance, across Atlantic, at least for his first term. How would you look at, his effort of trying to bring the G7 countries on board and rebooting this democratic solidarity, as he calls it?
I think the joint communique by G7 and the G7 and NATO, and already indicating, and Biden started to resume America's leadership in the world. And it's already much better than Trump's period. But I think it's difficult for Biden to resume America's global leadership to the level during Obama's period. The reason is that, first, and liberalism are no longer that popular, not only in the United States, but also not that popular in the European countries. Populism is a very, very strong competitor to liberalism. That's why it's difficult for Biden to resume liberalism as strong, as popular as Obama's period. And second, and the economically, and U.S. and cannot obtain high growth, and also he found that it's difficult to help American allies to obtain faster growth of the economy. So this economic situation will not make their own people happy. So he cannot have a very strong domestic support for his ideological policy.
It can be more complicated than some media commentators love to think. You also predicted that the bipolar reality of China and the U.S. being the two superpowers will not result in another Cold War. Why not?
The Cold War is a special competition between the major powers. It's not like the World War I and World War II, right? That means there's no direct war between the two superpowers. Second, the Cold War mainly carried out through proxy war. Without proxy war, it's not a Cold War. And the period between the two world wars is also quite, generally speaking, not that violent and relatively peaceful, but it is not a Cold War. Cold War refers to war, a kind of war. That means a proxy war. So in the visible future, I don't think there will be direct war between China and the U.S. And also, there are very less chance to see a proxy war between China and the U.S. And the reason is that China and the U.S. will compete mainly on the digital technology invention. So they, neither China and the U.S. and set up expanding their ideology or political system as the top priority. So what does it mean? It means that they compete for secular interests rather than the ideological interests.
So would you say the digital sector is one of those secular interests that Washington and American elites are thinking about?
Oh, yeah, that's core of it. That's the core interest concerned by both China and the U.S. Because in the next 10 or 20 years, and who obtain the digital superiority, who will become the global leader.
So for everyday people, what does that mean?
Yeah,
are we going to have two phones
everyone,
with different systems not compatible with each other?
No, it just means that in the U.S. and no any single American will tell that I hope U.S. will become weaker than China. In China, you cannot find any single Chinese say, hey, I don't want China being stronger than the U.S. So that's human nature. Every citizen hope their country is stronger than others.
You know, French President Emmanuel Macron said explicitly that, I quote, "I will be clear, the G7 is not a club hostile to China." How different do you predict the EU's approach towards China will be when you compare it towards Washington's approach to China?
Well, I think not only the EU leaders and every country reluctant to say, and their policy is targeted at any given country for some harmful purpose, but then their action can tell the truth. Generally speaking, I think European leaders will stand closer with the U.S. rather than with China, although these countries adopt the hedging strategy. So the hedging strategy means they will support China and the U.S. respectively on different issues. But meanwhile, it also means that China and cannot get the European support itself more than support the U.S. So I think the hedging strategy will be the general principle adopted by most of European countries.
What about America's Asia-Pacific partners and allies? Do you think they will also adopt this hedging strategy? When you think about Japan, South Korea, Australia, of course, with less doubt, also its recent partners like Indonesia, India.
Yeah, hedging strategy already becomes very popular among the third party and between China and the U.S. and including Japan, South Korea, and the ASEAN countries. Actually, hedging strategy initiated by the ASEAN countries. And we find the hedging strategy, although these countries all adopted a hedging strategy, but they're not exactly the same. Some hedging strategy is pro-China, some hedging strategy is pro-the U.S. But just it only means none of them will stand comprehensively at one side between these two. They will selectively to take sides according to specific issues.
Mm-hmm. In your book, Leadership and the Rise of Great Powers, you mentioned that China, its rise increased the possibility that East Asia will replace Europe as the new economic and political center of the world. How different do you envision a East Asia leadership will be when you compare it with the old European leadership?
Well, first, I have to say, and since the end of the World War II, and the European never served as a global leader. And during the Cold War, the leadership split between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. After the Cold War, American dominated the leadership. And when I said that the center of the world shifted from Europe to East Asia, it doesn't mean that the leadership shifted from Europe to Asia. It means the arena for great powers competition shifted from Europe to East Asia. That means in the next 20 years, and major powers competition will focus on East Asia, not the Europe. Europe will become less important, less valuable, less worthy for competition.
There's one more question I wanted to ask you about China-EU relationship.
Yeah.
You argue that moral realist theory perhaps is more useful in predicting interstate relations.
Yes.
But don't you think that ideology sometimes does get into bilateral relations too? For example, China and EU, their bilateral investment treaty was frozen by EU Parliament due by a large part to their differences on human rights.
Yes. I think the question is very, very important because many people believe because China and the EU has a very strong and wide economic relationship, the shared interest between China and the EU will prevent their bilateral relationship deteriorate. Actually, I think that is wrong. And in visible future, I mean the next 4 or 5 years, and the economic relationship between China and the EU will maintain quite stable. It will have the similar impact as before. But the ideological conflicts between China and the EU will getting worse and worse. So that means that the ideological conflicts will have a negative impact on this bilateral relationship. So my understanding that this relationship have more chance to getting worse rather than getting improved.
What can China do to really allay some of the fears that the European countries have towards, the issue of human rights in China?
I don't think Europeans are fear of China's ideology or political system. They just dislike it. They don't like it. So they said, we don't like your ideology and your system, and that's it. So because we don't like it, we don't want to be your friends.
So it's
And
largely
it's
stereotypes and bias?
I don't think they really feel China can pose ideological or political threat to Europe. No. And China, in the last few thousand years, China has almost no political or military impact on that continent. I think the people in that continent understand, well, this is a country far from us, except some economic business, and had nothing to do with us. Just whether we like their differences or their special characters or dislike.
Do you think there's such a thing as China model? And in what ways do you think this China model can inform perhaps the developing countries?
Well, I think the Chinese government have clearly stated, and it has no intention to export China's model. So from my understanding, China's model is defined as a kind of approach of development with Chinese characteristic. So this kind of achievement based on a very, very important precondition, the Chinese Communist leadership. From my understanding, besides China, except China, you cannot find any country has this precondition. That means you cannot find any country have a Chinese communist leadership. Without that precondition, I don't think these countries can follow Chinese model. Second, the model is with the Chinese characteristic, means that if that country has no Chinese characteristic, they cannot copy this model.
But no matter how many times Beijing says it doesn't intend to make the rest of the world Chinese, it doesn't want to export its political systems, many in the West simply don't buy it.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. And some people think the BRI is an approach to export China's model. Actually, if they examine the BRI project, they will find that first, all of the BRI projects are bilateral rather than multilateral. Why? That means you cannot make this kind of a cooperation multilaterally. So if everything is bilateral, I doubt you can make it it's a universal. And so I firmly believe Chinese model is a very, very special and with the special characteristic. And the question is not whether China want to export it or not. The question is whether other country can copy it or not. Just like you find the students and did very good with his exam, but his way to do the exam possibly cannot be copied by anyone else because he do it in a very special way.
How would you clarify, put into words some of the unique Chinese characteristics that you kept emphasizing?
I think the uniqueness of a Chinese model is that they adjusted the policy or the governance according to the change as quick as possible. And this is really difficult. And because whenever a government adopts a political principle, it's difficult to abandon it or to change it or reform it. But Deng Xiaoping strongly argued that, no, we have to and reform this country continuously, endlessly, according to the change of the objective environment. So I think this is really difficult for other countries to copy. So, like Deng Xiaoping even have a very well-known saying, and no matter what the color, white or black, and only catch the mouse is a good cat.
Yeah.
I doubt any other foreign government like to use this metaphor for to guiding their political principle.
Francis Fukuyama wrote an article back in March, lamenting the rigidity of the American system. It's very hard to sell the ideas of the political right to the left.
Yes.
It's very hard to
That's true.
or convince the liberals the right wing values.
Yeah.
Even such as the rigidity of the U.S. system.
So once some people ask me, and what's the difference between Chinese concept of legitimacy and Americans' concept, I said that for Chinese, legitimacy, it does not mean the process. It means the result. If you do something good, the result is good. Okay, that's legitimized. But in the U.S., it's opposite. They say, no. The question you have, the process should be legitimized. It's not the result. For Chinese, they consider you have good process, but then bring us a bad result. So what?
Very different ideologies, very different value systems, I would say. Professor Yan Xuetong, it is a true pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Thank you.